Hello everybody, welcome back to Between the Lines. This is essentially the final installment in a series of videos in which we've been doing a line-by-line analysis of the poem Nutting by William Wordsworth. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. Now, this is where we left off in the previous video. We saw that Wordsworth has left his cottage and gone deep into the woods in search of hazelnuts. That's why the poem is called Nutting, right? We see that Wordsworth has gone through an arduous journey. He's gone deep into the woods, and at last he finds himself in a little clearing or a little nook of the forest that is full of hazels. So he finally finds himself in the midst of so many hazelnuts, and he's just sitting there, and then he lies down there and he's enjoying the scenery, right? That's where we left off in the previous video. So let me read the lines and then we'll do an analysis. I heard the murmur and the murmuring sound in that sweet mood when pleasure loves to pay tribute to ease, and of its joy secure, the heart luxuriates with indifferent things, wasting its kindliness on stocks and stones and on the vacant air. Then up I rose. So in the previous video, we discussed how Wordsworth is in a little clearing, a little section of the forest, right? And we discussed how there is probably a spring or a river right next to where Wordsworth was, right? So you can imagine a little river flowing right next to where Wordsworth was. So Wordsworth is listening to the murmuring sound that is made by the little stream of water, right? A murmur is a low rumbling sort of sound, right? So when water flows and it makes sort of a gushing sound, that's what Wordsworth is referring to as a murmur. So he says, I heard the murmur and the murmuring sound in that sweet mood when pleasure loves to pay tribute to ease. So when he says in that sweet mood, he's talking once again about his temper, about what his mood was like when he was there in that little section of the forest. He says he was in that sweet mood, and he describes it in this way. He says he was in that sweet mood when pleasure loves to pay tribute to ease. So it is a particular positive mood in which pleasure enjoys paying tribute to ease. Now, ease is a condition in which you do not have any pain or any suffering or any hardship. That's what ease means, right? And to pay tribute to something is to give an offering to something because you respect it or because you admire it. That's what it means to pay tribute to something, right? And he says he was in a sweet mood in which pleasure loves paying tribute to ease. This is just a way of describing sort of the positive mood in which Wordsworth found himself in that little section of the forest, right? And he goes on to describe that mood in this way. He says, and of its joy secure, the heart luxuriates with indifferent things. So he says the heart, when it is in this mood, the heart is secure of its joy. It means that the heart does not feel like there is any impending danger to it or like there is any risk to it that will take away from this positive feeling, from this joy, right? So it says the heart is of its joy secure, which means the heart feels confident that, this state of joy is going to be almost like permanent. Right? So he says, and of its joy secure, the heart luxuriates with indifferent things. To luxuriate is to find luxury in something, to enjoy something, right? That's what it means. Let me write it now. To luxuriate is to find pleasure in something or to enjoy something. The heart luxuriates with indifferent things. Now, something that's indifferent is something that does not respond no matter what you do with it. So if you have a rock or like a handful of sand, right? No matter what you do to it, it's not going to do anything back. Like it's not going to respond. So that's what it means. Indifferent, let me write it down. You can say that indifferent means sort of unresponsive, right? So he says, when the heart is in this sort of elevated, joyful mood, it luxuriates or it takes pleasure in unresponsive things or dead things, things that do not have any life. So lifeless. Here in this context, indifferent means lifeless. Lifeless, right? So he says, my heart was so full of joy that it was taking pleasure in lifeless things. And he goes on to say once again, wasting its kindliness on stocks and stones. So he says his heart was wasting its gentleness on stocks and stones, which are obviously indifferent. They are lifeless. Stones do not have any life. But his heart at that moment was taking pleasure in the beauty and the serenity of the scene. So that's what he says. The heart luxuriates with indifferent things, wasting its kindliness on stocks and stones and on the vacant air. So vacant is once again something that's not occupied, something that's empty. So once again, air is something that's indifferent. Air doesn't have any life to it, right? So it says, and of its joy secure, the heart luxuriates with indifferent things, wasting its kindliness on stocks and stones and on the vacant air. So this was all about the scenery, setting the scene. What was it like to be in that little bower, in that little section of the forest, with that beautiful stream flowing by. Finally, we see that the narrative shifts dramatically. He says, then up I rose. The word then always indicates a shift, right? You were doing something before, and then you started doing something else. So this word then marks a shift in the narrative of the poem. So let's move on to the next slide. Then up I rose and dragged to earth both branch and bough with crash and merciless ravage, and the shady nook of hazels and the green and mossy bower, deformed and sullied, patiently gave up their quiet being, and, unless I now confound my present feelings with the past, from the mutilated bower I turned exulting, rich beyond the wealth of kings, I felt a sense of pain when I beheld the silent trees and saw the intruding sky. So this shift in the narrative is pretty much unexpected. All this while Wordsworth talked about the beauty of nature, how his heart was so full of joy, and all of a sudden we see that he was lying down there, it was all peaceful, it was very nice, it was beautiful, but then all of a sudden he had an urge to stand up and break all the branches violently. So we'll go through each line and try and understand, what exactly Wordsworth is trying to convey. He says he rose up and dragged to earth both branch and bough. So branch and bough both essentially mean the same thing. A bough is a branch, right? He's just using repetition in order to add emphasis. So this is just for emphasis. Branch and bough. And you can also see that there's a bit of alliteration there, branch and bough. Right? So he says he dragged to earth both branch and bough with crash and merciless ravage. He says he felt no mercy at the time when he was violently breaking the branches of those trees. And to ravage something is essentially to ruin something, to cause damage to something. Right? So he says he stood up, he broke all the branches, and he felt merciless as he was ravaging the trees, as he was damaging the trees severely. And the shady nook of hazels, so that little clearing of the forest, that little section of the forest, and the shady nook of hazels and the green and mossy bower. So once again, you see that there is this repetition here. In the previous line, he said branch and bough, and the branch essentially just means bough, and bough essentially just means branch. Similarly, he says, and the shady nook of hazels and the green and mossy bower. So the shady nook of hazels is the same as the green and mossy bower. Right? Those two terms mean essentially the same thing, and this repetition is just there for like a dramatic purpose. Right? It's just there for the emphasis, right? And the shady nook of hazels and the green and mossy bower, deformed and sullied. So the meaning of deformed is, when something has a particular form and then you change its form, you've deformed it, you've altered what it looks like. That's deformed, right? And to sully something is to make something dirty. So if something is pure and you go and ruin it, you make it, dirty. That's what it means to sully something, right? To make something dirty. I'll write it down here. To sully something is to make something dirty, right? So he says that beautiful little section of the forest, which was now deformed and sullied, patiently gave up their quiet being. He said that little section of the forest did not protest. That little section of the forest did not fight back. It could not fight back, right? And it just gave up. It patiently gave up as Wordsworth sort of violently attacked it, right? So he says, patiently gave up their quiet being. So he's referring to, obviously, the trees, right? And unless I now confound my present feelings with the past, from the mutilated bower I turned exulting, rich beyond the wealth of kings, I felt a sense of pain, right? So let's stop here. So he says, I'm not sure if I am confounding or sort of combining what I feel now with what I actually felt like back then. So he says, unless I now confound my feelings with the past. So he's not entirely sure. This is one way to interpret it. So Wordsworth is not entirely sure if he actually felt pain after the fact, after he had broken all the branches, after he had violently attacked the trees. Wordsworth is not entirely sure if he actually felt pain at that moment, or if he's regretting that action now and sort of retrospectively thinking back on what happened and trying to, come to terms with it. So he says, unless I now confound my present feelings with the past, so this is just before, right? This is sort of an archaic form of the word before. So from the mutilated bower I turned, exulting, rich beyond the wealth of kings, I felt a sense of pain. So he says, before I returned from that section of the forest, and I was rich beyond the wealth of kings, because obviously he had those hazelnuts with him, right? At this point, he had broken all the branches, and we can assume that he also took all the hazelnuts from the trees. So he says he was rich beyond the wealth of kings. So with these hazelnuts in hand, he feels as though he is richer than kings. And before we move on, to mutilate something is once again to deform something, to make something, ugly by deforming it, by changing its shape. Mutilate, it usually has a negative connotation. So he says, before he returned from that mutilated bower, and he was exulting. So exulting means to be in a state of great happiness, to be in a state of great joy. So he was triumphantly returning from that little section of the forest. So that's what it means. Before I returned from that mutilated bower, exulting triumphantly, rich beyond the wealth of kings, and I felt like I was richer than kings because I had these hazelnuts, and perhaps also because he had committed this act of tyranny against nature, against the trees, right? But then he goes on to say, I felt a sense of pain when I beheld the silent trees and saw the intruding sky. So finally he starts to regret what he's done. He says, I felt a sense of pain when I beheld. To beheld is to see something, right? Beheld, it is the past tense of behold, right? So he says, I felt a sense of pain, when I beheld, and to behold something is to see, right? So beheld means saw. When I beheld the silent trees and saw the intruding sky. The interesting thing is, the sky has always been there this entire time, Ever since Wordsworth stepped out of his cottage, the sky, was always above him. Even when he was inside the cottage, it was always above him. But now he suddenly feels like the sky is sort of looking down at him and maybe perhaps even judging him, right? That's why he says intruding. To intrude is to So if something is already going on and you poke your nose in it, you'll be intruding, right? Like an intruder is someone who, for example, breaks into a compound or a house or something, right? So he feels like the sky is now intruding because he knows that he's done something bad, and his guilt is making him feel like the sky is sort of judging him, or the sky is intruding. So that's how he feels. I felt a sense of pain when I beheld the silent trees and saw the intruding sky. Let's move on. These are the final 3 lines of the poem. Then, dearest maiden, move along these shades in gentleness of heart, with gentle hand touch, for there is a spirit in the woods. So finally, we see that the entire poem was sort of aimed at Wordsworth's sister. So this reference to dearest maiden is just a reference to Wordsworth's sister. So he says, my dear sister, move along these shades. So when you're in the woods, when you're in the forest, walk through the forest in gentleness of heart. Do not be arrogant like a lot of humans are, right? He says, walk along these shades, move along these shades in gentleness of heart. Be gentle when you're in the midst of nature, with gentle hand touch. So when you touch nature, when you have to interact with nature, if you want to pluck a fruit or a flower, be gentle, right? That is the message of the poem. With gentle hand touch. And he finally gives us a reason why we should be gentle with nature. For there is a spirit in the woods. So when something has a spirit, it means that it's alive. It has a soul, right? So he says the woods are alive. They are not indifferent. It is not like they cannot react. It is just that they choose not to react, perhaps. Right? So he gives us this beautiful reason that there is a spirit in the woods, and therefore you must not attack nature. So we've finally come to the end of the poem. I hope you found this series of videos helpful. I've done my best to try and break things down and make everything as clear as possible. And in the future, I'll try and make better and better videos as we progress. If you like this content, if you have suggestions, if you'd like me to cover a particular poem or a novel or anything like that, please feel free to leave a comment. And just thanks a lot for tuning in. Have a good day. Bye.